Have you ever been driving down the highway when traffic suddenly slows? Instead of keeping your eyes forward on the road ahead, you slow down too, just for a second to catch a glimpse of what happened. Or late at night when you're on your phone, you find yourself drawn to a graphic true crime story, disturbing news footage, or maybe even a clip that your friend sent you from Twitter. You see, this impulse has a name and it's called morbid curiosity. It's far from being a simple flaw or a sign of weakness. It's actually something that's very deeply human and natural. It's wired into us through evolution. Our ancestors survived by observing threats and dangers from a safe distance. And in the modern world, horror films, graphic media, shocking content, it gives us a controlled, simulated version of that same experience. The rush of adrenaline and the relief when the experience ends. It can help us process real-world anxieties in a safe container or simply deliver a thrill that ordinary life and day-to-day rarely provides. Most disturbing media, even though the most intense, you see, it eventually offers some sort of release, catharsis, insight. But what happens when a film removes nearly all of those safety nets and offers only unrelenting, clinical, and repetitive confrontation with no easy exit? That is precisely what Pasolini's Salo, or the 120 Days of Sodom, sets out to do. It takes our natural morbid curiosity and pushes it further, turning the act of looking into something cold, inescapable, and deeply unsettling. Heavy spoilers and extremely graphic content follow. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. This film is not for everyone and contains material that many will find deeply disturbing. To understand why Salo feels so extreme, we must first look at its roots and the man who brought it to the screen. The foundation is Marquis de Sade's The 120 Days of Sodom. I also don't know if I'm pronouncing that name wrong, so I'm just going to call him Marquis. Written in 1785 while Marquis was imprisoned, he composed the text on a continuous scroll made from tiny scraps of paper glued together. It was eventually lost, but of course, it was eventually found and published in 1904, becoming an infamous underground classic that explores the absolute limits of power, pleasure, and human depravity without moral restraint. Pasolini was born in 1922. He was no stranger to these themes himself. He lived through the rise of fascism, and as a young man, he took part in activities in the very region that would become the Republic of Salo, and developed a complex identity as a poet, novelist, Marxist, atheist, and openly gay artist. His earlier films, such as The Gospel According to St. Matthew and The Trilogy of Life, often celebrated raw human vitality and sensuality with a poetic eye. But by the 1970s, however, Pasolini had grown profoundly disillusioned with modern consumerism, the commodification of bodies and desires, and what he saw as a lingering authoritarian tendencies in supposedly democratic societies. Salo was his final film, completed just weeks before his unsolved murder in November of 1975. Rather than a literal adaptation of Marquis's work, Pasolini transplanted the story into the final days of the fascist Italian Social Republic in 1944. He transformed Marquis's philosophical sadism into a stark political allegory about how absolute power, whether it's fascist or consumerist, reduces human beings to objects to be consumed and discarded. Pasolini himself described it as a sinister connection between consumerism and the dehumanizing machinery of fascism, portraying both as systems that detach from human suffering and treat bodies as interchangeable matter. With this context established, the film itself unfolds as a meticulously structured descent into hell on earth, one that tests both the characters and the audience's capacity to keep watching. Salo is deliberately structured like Dante's Inferno. It's divided into 4 segments that chart as an escalating erosion of humanity under absolute control. In 1944, in the crumbling fascist Republic of Salo, 4 powerful libertines kidnap 18 teenagers, 9 boys, 9 girls. They retreat with them to a remote fortified villa along with armed guards and 4 older prostitutes who serve as storytellers. Strict rules are imposed and formally signed: total submission, no escape, no God. Throughout the entire film, the camera remains cool, observational, creating a clinical detachment that amplifies the horror by refusing to look away or offer any emotional relief. This opening segment sets the rules and stakes with cold efficiency. Victims are rounded up, inspected, transported under extreme duress. The libertines arrange forced marriages amongst themselves and each other's daughters, who are then pulled into the victim pool themselves, blurring any remaining lines between perpetrator and the prey. One desperate young man attempts to escape but is swiftly shot in front of the others, establishing immediately that resistance is not only futile, but instantly and publicly punished. Names are stripped away. The teenagers become mere sons and daughters in the libertines' domain. The tone is established early and never wavers. Beauty in the framing, inevitability in the dread, and a grounding sense that normal human boundaries no longer exist. Circle of manias. Psychological and sexual humiliation takes center stage in this circle and begins to systematically erode the victim's sense of self. The storytellers recount elaborate erotic tales designed to arouse the captors, who then force the victims into rituals of obedience and violation. Specific examples include the daughters being made to serve meals while they're completely naked, only to be deliberately tripped and assaulted by the guards, forced performative marriages between victims that mock any possibility of genuine connection or intimacy, and humiliating public demonstrations using mannequins or direct commands that reduce bodies to objects of instruction. The libertines philosophize about power, excess, and freedom, even as they oversee the suffering, treating the entire ordeal as both entertainment and an intellectual exercise. It is sadism rendered bureaucratic and organized, fascism made intimate and personal, with every act framed as part of a larger philosophical project, the circle of shit. The degradation moves from the psychological to the bodily and deeply symbolic. Victims face extreme restrictions on normal bodily functions and are forced into acts of consumption, including extended scenes of meals consisting of human excrement, served and eaten under duress. They are made to crawl on all fours like animals. Pasolini uses this circle as a visceral, unforgettable metaphor, how systems of power turn people into consumable, disposable matter. The circle of blood. The film reaches its brutal, unrelenting climax. A grotesque black mass wedding unfolds with the libertines in drag, presiding over perverse ceremonies that mock religion and ritual. This gives way to systematic physical torture and execution, burnings, scalping, tongue extractions, gouging, shootings. Victims are mutilated, displayed like trophies, and discarded, while the perpetrators observe with detached satisfaction or even mild boredom. You see, there is no redemption. There's no meaningful resistance that succeeds. There's no cathartic release for the audience. The film just ends on a haunting, ambiguous note. Two young guards outside of the villa, casually dancing and chatting about ordinary things like their girlfriends back home. Indifferent, complicit, they're simply numb. The structure closes not with triumph or moral clarity, but with the quiet continuation of the system. You see, on an intellectual and thematic level, Salo is ambitious and often very powerful. Pasolini uses the villa as a vessel, absolute authority that commodifies bodies and souls, turning intimacy into performance, resistance into futility, and people into disposable objects to be used and discarded. The progression across the circles is rigorous and intellectually very coherent, from psychological domination to bodily degradation to physical annihilation, mirroring how regimes and systems erode humanity step by step. The film excels at showing complicity. Victims, guards, storytellers, they all become entangled, all of the horror reflecting on how societies enable atrocity through indifference, participation, or simple self-preservation. Pasolini refuses to offer any catharsis, easy moral distance, or comforting resolution. It forces the audience to confront the abyss without the usual cinematic illusions that soften the blow. The story's execution through excess is meant to be a mirror to excess of power itself. Unfortunately for all of Salo's ambition, it encounters real limitations in execution that affect how effectively its story and themes land. The unrelenting and repetitive nature of the depravity can begin to feel fetishized. Extended sequences of humiliation and excess often prioritize raw provocativeness over deeper emotional or philosophical illumination. You see, the duration and the intensity of some of these scenes often risk turning what should be a sharp political critique into something that's more of a pacer test, one that exhausts the audience's capacity for engagement before the full weight of the allegory can even settle. The clinical, detached style, intended as a alienation to provoke intellectual reflection, sometimes has the unattended effect of making the victims feel like interchangeable props in a exercise rather than fully realized people whose suffering carries any sort of weight. Because the camera observes without empathy or identification, and because the victims remain largely without any sort of individuality or personality, any arcs or voices that distinguish them, the human cost can become abstract. The story's execution relies on the libertine's control and the episodic, vignette-driven structure inherited from Marquise's story, and that unfortunately prioritizes philosophical demonstration over narrative momentum or character development. This can make the suffering feel repetitive rather than progressively devastating. While the underlying anti-fascist and anti-consumerist message is very clear on paper, the volume and repetition of shock can overpower that message, leaving audiences feeling exhausted or repelled rather than any sort of reflectiveness that's meaningful. And because of all of this, Salo sometimes comes across to most people as shock for shock's sake, even as it maintains its serious political intent. Other extreme works manage to channel graphic suffering toward a clearer sense of direction, build-up, sometimes even a payoff. Martyrs, for example, uses its intense violence in service of a focused, philosophical, and existential quest, transcendence through pain, the search for meaning in suffering, giving the horror a narrative and thematic engine that builds towards something haunting and purposeful. Salo, by contrast, it can sometimes dilute the very critique it seems to deliver. The episodic structure and lack of emotional anchors means the political allegory, while it's powerful, does not always cut as deeply into the viewer's conscience as the film's ambition demands. The execution of the story prioritizes the demonstration of power's logic over the felt experience of its victims, which can leave the audience intellectually aware but emotionally fatigued, a gap between intent and impact that is worth examining when we consider how extreme cinema chooses to depict the darkest corners of human behavior. More than 50 years after its release, Salo still remains as one of cinema's most banned, censored, and passionately debated films. It stands as Pasolini's final artistic statement and a provocative landmark in political and extreme cinema. Its influence on discussions about the limits of representation, the role of shock in art, and the nature of power continues to this day. Even in our current era of desensitization and unchecked authority, its warnings about detachment and complicity, it still resonates very strongly. At the same time, its complicated legacy invites us to ask harder questions about the execution and storytelling. Does the film ultimately reward our natural curiosity with genuine insight, or does its method of unrelenting excess sometimes undermine its own goals? When a story relies so heavily on repetition and clinical distance, does the political message land with full force, or does the audience's fatigue become part of the experience, intentional or not?